Welcome to Carroll Motor Company's video tutorial series, walking you through everything from unboxing to test starting your new Carroll brand 16 horsepower gas engine with electric starter option. Today we're going to show you how to replace an ignition coil. Before we begin, you will need a 10mm wrench, socket, or impact drill to complete this task. You don't necessarily need a socket extension for the job, but it does make it much easier. We'll begin by taking off the air filter housing. Remove the plastic wing nut holding it in place and shimmy the cover off the bolt. Begin disconnecting the current ignition coil by pulling on the black connector that runs behind the air filter. Use your 10mm socket to remove the nuts holding the air filter in place. You don't want to take it off, just slide it forward slightly so you can work behind it. Next, you will need to pull the shroud off the flywheel. It's held in place by 4 bolts. Detach the ignition coil from the plastic clasp on top of the shroud. Remove the shroud by lifting up and then out from the bottom. Now you have a full view of the ignition coil held in place by 2 10mm bolts. Use a socket to remove the bolts, and don't worry about mixing up your bolts. There's a clear size difference that makes them easy to sort. Pull out the black wire that runs over the top of the engine through to the front. Now it's time to take off the air filter. Twist off the wing nut holding it down and remove the filter. The plastic base holding it in place will come off easily. This reveals another 10mm bolt holding the air filtration cylinder in place. Remove it with a socket, disconnect the hose coming from the overhead valve, and slide the filtration system forward just far enough to pull the ignition coil through to the other side. Pull up on the coil to disconnect it from the clamps behind the air filter and slide it through. With that, you've successfully disconnected the old ignition coil from the motor. Now let's install your new ignition coil. Begin by fishing the coil back behind the air filtration cylinder. Slide the filter back and finger tighten one nut to hold it steady. Run the thin wire from the coil over the engine but under the gas tank, and be sure the wire does not touch the gear teeth on the flywheel. Have some patience for this part. Even for a professional, it's not as easy as it looks. When setting the ignition coil next to the flywheel, use a business card to ensure proper position. Once set, replace the 10mm bolts. Before tightening into final position, remove the business card and spin the flywheel 360 degrees to make sure the ignition coil allows for a full range of motion. If it does, congratulations, you've done it right. Next, you need to put the air filter back together. Replace the 10mm bolt to the top of the filtration cylinder, connect the ignition coil to the overhead valve, and reconnect the small hose from the overhead valve to the filtration cylinder. Replace the nuts on the front of the filter and tighten all 3 bolts on the air filter back into place. Add the air filter platform back onto the long bolt and be sure the 2 small holes in the base are facing toward the flywheel. Put the air filter back on and replace the wing nut. Now let's add back the shroud with the pull cord. Push it up from underneath and then in from the bottom. Screw in the 4 short 10mm bolts with your socket. If you have any issues lining up the holes, you may need to reposition some of the hoses and wires. Last but not least, put the air filter cap back on the housing, and the job is done. Whew, that took a while. But if you have any questions, you don't have to wait to talk to someone right away. Give us a call at Carroll Motor Company by dialing 888-208-2088. For full stock listings and prices, visit carrollstream.com.